All right, everybody, welcome to today's lecture. Today we're going to be talking about the post-war period, the decade of the 1920s. This is a fun period of U.S. history, sort of a decade to be delineated out. It is a time when cultural norms are being challenged, largely norms about gender roles and feminine sexuality. It is a time when the United States attempted to regulate morality by passing prohibition and regulating the habits of drinking that people had. It was a time of jazz music. It was a time of bootlegging and speakeasies. And it was a time, as we will come to find out, when white America and the virtues attendant with Anglo-Saxon culture will be upheld in the United States under the guise of something known as nativism. And so we're going to take a look at all of this, and we're going to jump right in. And so let us begin. Okay, it says, as Americans began to evaluate the impact and overall scope of World War I, they also began to reevaluate traditional views of Western society and outdated values and practices. And the reason why Americans begin to do this, and I would argue that even Europeans are doing this, is because World War I shattered perceptions of human evolution and human adaptation, right? What we believed had happened was that Americans and the world, humanity, had progressed beyond the need for war, that we had evolved in some sort of way to a certain higher plateau of living, right? And then World War I, as one historian note, dealt a shattering blow to the widespread belief that Western civilization was progressing, right? In fact, one would argue that they were regressing. No time in human history before had man enacted such horrors upon one another, right? And so how can we hold this notion that we are progressing, that Western civilization is moving forward, when Western civilization just enacted the most horrific war ever seen on the face of the planet, right? This myth of progression was one that had dominated the public consciousness for over a century, right? And it gets shattered. And so people begin to question. They begin to contemplate, the values and virtues associated with how they were living, largely Victorian ideals of how people should live, right? And this questioning of Victorian ideologies, this question of traditional values is actually going to find a backlash. And we're going to be talking about that backlash first, particularly how it was expressed in the United States. But just recognize and understand that World War I reshaped the way people think and the way people thought. It says, in reaction to new ideas, in reaction to this questioning, a new movement known as modernism developed among artists, writers, and intellectuals, where they recognized and explored the notion that Western society had, quote, entered an era of bewildering change. Now, in fact, modernism, or the philosophical ideological perspective of modernism, actually began long before the 1900s and didn't necessarily originate in the United States, but modernism becomes an artistic expression in the 1920s where people are beginning to question things through artistic venues, right? Whether that be art or playwrights or literature, what have you. They're questioning, they're challenging the way that life had been lived in order to explore potentially a new way to understand society, okay? And again, this is all due to the ramifications of World War I. It goes on to state that post-war Americans also experienced a period of political and social radicalism, where strikes, race riots, and anti-communist hysteria ruled the day. And nativism is an extreme form of nationalism, it emerged in the United States. And the reality is that nativism is predicated on the idea of what a gentleman by the name of Paul Spickard calls normative whiteness. And let me read something to you from a book called Almost All Aliens. And Spickard writes this. He says, "This book employs some concepts that may not be familiar to all readers. One of these is normative whiteness. This is a way to describe the very common assumption that unless we are informed to the contrary, the people under discussion are white. Normal people are, by definition and without remark, white people. If one is white, then one is a person, but if one is not white, then one's not whiteness needs to be explained. When we read the pages of most daily newspapers, we find race marked only for people of color. There are people, and then there are black people. There are people, and there are Native Americans. People, that is white people, have names and personalities. Non-white people have races. We only mark those who diverge from the norm we presume, which is normative whiteness." Now, the reason why I bring that up is because in the United States, this concept of nativism is rooted around this idea of normative whiteness. And particularly, it's rooted around the idea of a white Anglo-Protestant culture. Okay? When many post-war Americans began to challenge and question, religious Christianity, they began to challenge traditional Victorian traditions and gender roles, right? There was another group of people who backlashed against those ideas, and they attempted to uphold what they called this sort of nativistic Anglo-American Protestant normative white culture. Okay? Things are changing in the United States in the post-war world. Okay? It says here, defenders of tradition. And again, the tradition would be that normative whiteness. Defenders of tradition located the germs of radicalism in the polyglot cities teeming with immigrants and foreign ideas. The defensive mood of the 1920s fed on a growing tendency to connect American nationalism with nativism, which was Anglo-Saxon racism and militant Protestantism. In other words, the 1920s was a period of cultural, social, and political radicalism and hysteria, in addition to being a time of jazz music and speakeasies and what have you. Okay. Now, it says, while the 1920s is highly remembered for these speakeasies, for the bootlegging, for the flapper, and we'll talk about these things, one of the most significant movements of the 1920s is nativism. And I want to talk briefly about nativism and sort of go through some examples of where we can see nativism occurring in the United States. And again, I think it's important to maybe keep in mind this idea of normative whiteness, right? Because when we're talking about people who are nativistic, they are largely individuals who would prescribe to this normative whiteness, right? We are talking about an Anglo-Saxon racism and militant Protestantism. In the wake of World War I, when Christianity, when gender roles, when life in general gets challenged by a new wave of youth, some of these other individuals respond by trying to militantly push these more traditional values. Okay? So let's take a look at how this would look. Defined, nativism is the policy of protecting the interests of native inhabitants, and again, we're talking about white Anglo-Protestants, okay, against those of immigrants, right? In a large sense, this is an extreme form of nationalism. Again, let's remember that defenders of tradition located the germs of radicalism in the polyglot cities teeming with immigrants and foreign ideas. So nativists looked to immigrants, and they said, there's your problem. They threaten American culture. They bring, different ideas. Some of these people are socialists and anarchists. Some of them are Catholic, and you have all these nativists who look to these cities and look to these immigrants, and it is in them that they find the root of the problem. Okay? It says after World War I, for example, quote, over half the white men and a third of the white women working in manufacturing were foreign-born, and most of them from Central and Eastern Europe. This large percentage of foreign-born workers made many quote-unquote native Anglo-Americans suspicious, right, and helped spawn the period of racial nativism, a period in which Anglo, white, Protestant American values were attempted to be upheld. Okay, so Now that I've beat that horse to death, let me give you some examples of how you actually could see this unfolding in the United States. Okay, let's begin with one of the more eerie of the group, and that is the Ku Klux Klan. All right, so the Ku Klux Klan is a perfect example of a physical representation of nativism, right? What we understand from the KKK is that originally, traditionally, they attempted to uphold a sense of normative whiteness, right, against the onslaught of freed slaves after the Civil War. And in fact, Pulaski, Tennessee, 1866, that's where the Ku Klux Klan originates. But it sort of fizzles out at the turn of this century, only to come back in force during the 1920s. Part of the reason why the Ku Klux Klan fizzles out at the turn of the 19th century into the 20th is because there were many small Klan dens in the South, but they were relegated to the South, and these clans were not well organized and they were not unified. Okay, and so they sort of dissipated. At the turn of the century and the rise of nativism within the United States, what the Ku Klux Klan espoused, this sort of, again, Anglo-Saxon racism and militant Protestantism, right, that begins to resonate with many Americans. And so the Ku Klux Klan as an organization expands, and it expands not only in the South, but it expands into the entire United States, right? And by the 1920s, it's not just African Americans that the Ku Klux Klan will target. As we can also see, they're going to target Roman Catholics. That would include the Irish, Jews, immigrants of various kinds, and African Americans, right? They are going to move against groups of people who they perceive to be a threat to this sort of normative white Anglo culture, right? This is what its founder said. It said, "America was no melting pot." William J. Simmons, the Klan's founder, warned. He said, "Rather, it's a garbage can. When the hordes of aliens walk to the ballot box and their votes outnumber yours, then that alien horde has got you by the throat," right? And so what the Klan begins to espouse is this idea of 100% Americanism, right? And really, when you get into U.S. history, this becomes a very difficult thing to address. And in fact, I read to you from Paul Spickert's book, Almost All Aliens, and one of his arguments, his chief argument, is that we're all almost aliens. Almost all of us are aliens in this land at some point. So to talk about this idea of a Native American, right, what does that mean, right? But for the Klan, that meant 100% Americanism, the Christian faith, okay, Anglo-Saxon traditions, whiteness, right? Now, initially, the KKK reemerged on Thanksgiving night, April 15th, in Atlanta, Georgia, and the Klan would eventually go national as nativism took a greater hold on the American population. And I want to show you some pictures here of one particular Klan rally in 1925. And here it is. Okay, this is a 1925 Klan rally staged down Pennsylvania Avenue in Washington, D.C. There were approximately 40,000 Ku Klux Klan members. Now, what you have in the back, of course, is the Capitol building. And the reason why I demonstrate, or I place this here, is to illustrate the centrality of nativism to American thinking, right? Today, such a rally probably would not be permitted to walk down Pennsylvania Avenue. There are Klan rallies, but nothing of this size and scope. And I would suspect today, and it's kind of funny, but particularly with Barack Obama sitting as president, right, you definitely would not have this there, okay? But one of the things I want to point out is they are sort of representatives of what the United States believes and holds to be dear, right? They're walking in front of the Capitol, therefore they're sort of representatives of the American system. They're touting American flags. They are representatives, right? These white knights are the representatives of American virtue and values. The fact that you can have 40,000 of them march down Pennsylvania Avenue, and specifically Pennsylvania Avenue, indicates that this wasn't something that the Klan just held to. This must have been something that was tolerated by the general population. And so when we're speaking about the 1920s, we want to remember that it's not just a time where people are, drinking illegal gin and moonshine and beer. It is not just a time when flappers are dancing to jazz music, right? This is a time when Americans become extremely militantly nativistic. And this picture source represents that. Okay, let's move on to a couple more. Okay, again, this should give you the scope of just how large that was. Again, 40,000 Klan members, and then also, ladies, you were also there. Okay, but the idea here is just to get you to sort of wrap your mind around the idea that the Klan, for some people, represented what America should be. And that's a difficult thing to talk about, particularly in a day like today, right? In the 21st century, we want to think that this is sort of an antiquated thing, but yet this was less than 100 years ago, right? It's just interesting concept to think about, that this was what Americans, as a general whole, at least a significant minority, if not a significant majority, this is what was representative of what America should be. Okay, interesting. Okay, let's move on. Alright, it says, during the 1920s, the Ku Klux Klan reached the height of its power and membership, and as a result of nativism, the Klan was no longer relegated to the South. In fact, you could feel its influence across the entire nation. Okay? And the Klan was very powerful. In fact, anybody could have been a member of the Ku Klux Klan, and anybody was a member of the Ku Klux Klan. You had engineers, accountants, business owners, superintendents, clergymen, you had lawyers, judges, police officers, and in fact, because of the membership, it was very difficult to convict the Klan of crimes. And oftentimes when the Klan was brought to trial, they were given all-white juries who acquitted them of any of their crimes. Okay? In order to illustrate kind of what the Klan was like during the 1920s, I want you to go ahead and click on the word South. You can see that the UT and H are in green, and that's going to take you to a section of a film on the Ku Klux Klan that the History Channel has put together, the secret history of the Ku Klux Klan, and it's going to talk briefly about what the Klan was like during the 1920s. So you can sort of get a feel even more of the impact of the Klan upon American society. So go ahead and watch that, and then move on to the next slide. Okay, hopefully you watched the film on the Ku Klux Klan. Generally that should hopefully trouble you a bit, but also demonstrate the power of the Klan at the time. Now it says here that, as was always the case, the Ku Klux Klan was set on preserving white womanhood, Christian morality, I would argue a warped notion of Christian morality, but nonetheless, okay? And they always looked to appeal to the masses as a means to gain membership to their organization. It says, as one historian noted, the robes, the flaming crosses, the eerie processionals, the kneeling recruits, the occult liturgies, all tapped into a deep urge toward mystery and brought drama into the dreary routine of 1,000 communities. And the Klan grew in power, it grew in prestige, right? It grew, it grew, it grew, okay? It does eventually decline, and today the Klan is not as influential as it once had been. But the point I'm trying to make here is that the Ku Klux Klan is evidence, physical evidence, organizational evidence of nativism, right? This attempt again to uphold the normative whiteness in the United States during the 1920s, because there was this perception of a horde of immigrants, that American culture, that American identity, that what it meant to be an American was being threatened, and those who were threatening America needed to be dealt with. Okay, so the Ku Klux Klan is one example. Okay, another example, and this may come not so much as a shock, but just sort of as an aha minute, but Prohibition could also be understood in terms of nativism. Okay, going back to my book America, A Narrative History, it says Prohibition of alcoholic beverages offered another example of reforming zeal, channeled into a drive for moral righteousness and social conformity. Right? Prohibition in many respects was an attempt by largely women, albeit there were men, but there was a lot of women who forwarded temperance and prohibition. But it was an attempt by these reformers to regulate America's morality, to instill Christian ethics, right? Moral ethics upon a drinking population that these people saw as being harmful to society. And so prohibition is going to gain prominence. And you can understand that in terms of nativism. Okay, so let's take a look at prohibition. All right, now prohibition doesn't emerge out of a vacuum. In fact, there had been many temperance movements in the 19th century prior to the Civil War. These temperance movements generally didn't succeed in gaining many dry counties, albeit by the time prohibition it comes around, there are many dry states. It's just that some of these societies, like the Anti-Saloon League and the Women's Christian Temperance Union, they wanted to see a more national ban on alcoholic beverage, and so there was going to need to be a constitutional amendment, which will pass. It's the 18th Amendment, and it will pass. But just understand that there is a history already associated with prohibition that goes back almost 100 years of many, and again mainly women, seeking to temper the drinking habits of most Americans. Now, why women? And this is an important question. And the reason why it's mainly women is because of the societal norms of the day, right? Women, even in the 1920s, were not considered to be appropriately out in the workforce, especially if they had children. If you have children, your job is to be home and to mother them, right? It is the father's job. The problem with this, of course, is that husbands would frequently frequent saloons, spend all the money. You know, there's booze, there's prostitutes, right, at these saloons. So there's this sort of sense of irrepute. It's immoral for men to be going and get drunk and having sex with these prostitutes, and then coming home and raping their wives and beating their children, right? And when there's no money left for food, then, you know, it is the women and children who are left to starve. And so, you know, it makes sense that women would be the ones to crusade against temperance, okay? And to crusade for, I'm sorry, not against, but for temperance, to crusade against the consumption of alcohol, okay? So, moving to the bottom of this slide, it says the desire to ban alcohol on a national level, not just local, state, county levels, but on a national level, began at the turn of the century when the Women's Christian Temperance Union and the Anti-Saloon League began pushing for a national prohibition law. Okay, it's going to take them a little bit of time, but they will be successful. Okay, let's move on. It says, to gain support for their cause, these groups built, quote, upon the general moral disrepute of saloons, right? The general disrepute of saloons. Men are getting drunk, men are spending all the money, men are having sex with prostitutes, that kind of thing, right? And they also provided new scientific evidence which proved the harmful consequences of alcohol on one's body. And so, in an attempt to regulate what people could do, these leagues, these organizations begin to push and apply pressure to the American government to pass a constitutional amendment banning your ability to drink. It says by 1910, the Anti-Saloon League had not only become an extremely powerful pressure group, but had done well to convince Protestant churches, right? Turn this into a moral issue, right? It can't just be a biological issue. It has to be a moral issue. When you throw moral and morality behind it, it gives it some weight. In fact, it's one of the main things that got slavery to come to an end. You know, by painting slavery in a moral picture, that it's a sin, right? Then you begin to gain some headway. Well, that's sort of what happens here, right? That drinking is a sin. And so Protestant churches become more involved in the temperance movements, and they begin to push their congregations and to support what they call dry candidates, political people who will vote dry, right? It says by 1916, the League was so successful in convincing the government that an amendment to the Constitution banning alcohol was needed. And starting in 1916, both houses of Congress began to vote and discuss in favor of an amendment to the Constitution, limiting, restricting, fully prohibiting the manufacture, sale, and consumption of alcoholic beverages. Okay, moving forward. Goes on to say that the move towards total prohibition, at least in Congress, had begun by 1916, and by December 1917, Congress sent to the states the 18th Amendment, and within 1 year, ratified on January 16, 1919, the 18th Amendment to the Constitution will be passed, which will ban the sale, manufacture, and transport of intoxicating liquors in the United States. And what happened after January 16, 1919, right, was that law-abiding citizens, many law-abiding citizens, immediately became unlawful, right? Because most did not stop drinking, right? Now, that's a quick and dirty historical context to the passage of Prohibition. There's a lot more context that can be had, and if you're really interested in Prohibition, I would encourage you to locate and watch Ken Burns' documentary called Prohibition, and it provides a lot more context explaining how this movement began, where it moved, and why and how it eventually came about, right? It also talks about the consequences and its ultimate demise, but if you want to go deeper into that topic, I would encourage you to go ahead and take a look at that documentary, or if you like to read, there's a great book written by Daniel Okrent called Last Call, The Rise and Fall of Prohibition. And in fact, this author is one of the visiting historians on that particular documentary by Ken Burns. And Daniel Okrent writes the following. He says, "How did it happen?" He says, "How did a freedom-loving people decide to give up a private right that had been freely exercised by millions upon millions since the first European colonists arrived in the New World? How did they condemn to extinction what was, at the very moment of its death, the fifth largest industry in the nation?" And I think it's important to recognize that when Prohibition comes into place, the manufacture, sale, and distribution of alcohol is the fifth largest industrial sector of the American economy. And I want to pose this question to you. What do you think would happen today if we kicked out and prohibited the commodity that the fifth largest sector of the U.S. economy produced? That would put millions of people out of work. Trade would drop. It would cause an economic crisis. And I submit to you, not that Prohibition caused the Great Depression, but I submit that 10 years later, after Prohibition goes into place, there's a Great Depression. Is there a connection between the two? I would say yes, there probably is. Okrent goes on to ask, how did they append to their most sacred document, the Constitution, 112 words that knew only one president in American history? With that single previous exception, the original Constitution and its first 17 amendments limited the activities of government, not of citizens. Okay, not of citizens. He goes on to write that few realized that Prohibition's birth and development were much more complicated than that. In truth, January 16, 1920 signified a series of innovations and alterations revolutionary in their impact. The alcoholic miasma enveloping much of the nation in the 19th century had inspired a movement of men and women who created a template for political activism that was still being followed a century later. Okay? It says, in 1920, could anyone have believed that the 18th Amendment, ostensibly addressing the single subject of intoxicating beverages, would set off an avalanche of change, and change it would set. Major changes. Okay? Now, what did Prohibition do? It meant the nation was dry. It didn't mean people stopped drinking. Okay? Many people continued to drink, right? And that, of course, means that there is a demand for alcoholic beverages, and people will generally meet that with some kind of supply. Sorry for that pause. Okay. All right, let's move forward. All right, it says here that one of the results of the 18th Amendment was the rise of speakeasies, right? What is a speakeasy? A speakeasy is an illegal club where alcohol was sold. And I'm going to be showing you a film a little bit later where it's going to show you a couple of speakeasies. But these are interesting little spots, right? Many of them were underground. You had to have a password to get in. If the fuzz showed up, these speakeasies were equipped with various contraptions to hide or to destroy the alcohol so that you could continue on with your day, right? But these speakeasies rise up. These are illegal bars that are being given or sold, not given, rather being sold illegal alcohol, right? To give to the large number of patrons who are coming by, right? You also have bootlegging, right? This develops. People strapping bottles of booze to their boots and hiding it and taking it into these speakeasies or what have you, right? Prohibition also created and helped to develop crime syndicates and the mob, right? It says these illegal activities sprung up overnight. It says, for example, within less than 8 months after the amendment took effect, authorities found a still, probably a moonshine still or a whiskey still, with a daily capacity of 130 gallons near Austin, Texas, right? This is where you get sort of that bathroom gin, moonshine in the backwoods, right? Rum runners souping up their cars and, throwing boxes of moonshine in the back to deliver it, right? Why did they have to soup up their cars? In order to outrun the police. When Prohibition comes to an end, these rum runners who had souped up their cars had nothing to do with their cars, so they created a new sport called NASCAR. Okay, so thank you, Prohibition, if you are a NASCAR fan, all right? But Prohibition allotted and provided an opportunity to make large sums of money. And it says the ability to make large sums of money was a reality to those who capitalized upon it, who bootlegged, who sold the drink. And more often than not, they were not caught, frankly, because Congress, federal authorities could not enforce the Prohibition law. And as it will become very clear, Prohibition is not a success. It was never successful. And yet, presidents continued to enforce it, right? Despite the fact that it was not working. We have to understand that economically speaking, Prohibition was a huge problem because it not only shut down industries, which laid people off and meant that those laid off people no longer have as much money to spend, right? But the truth of the matter is that whether you like it or not, the government gets tax revenues off of alcoholic beverages. And so, when Prohibition's put into place, the government's no longer getting these taxes. And that's going to hurt the economy as well. Okay? So instead of the government getting the taxes, which, that's a discussion in and of itself, what you have are, maybe we can call them gangster entrepreneurs, right? Pseudo-capitalists, if you will, who recognize that there's a need for this commodity, and so they're going to meet that need. Basic supply and demand, right? All right, let's move on. Okay, as already alluded to, it says here that Prohibition failed to temper the sale and distribution of alcohol, as the speakeasies and the bootlegger clearly attest, right? And it also fostered an arena for crime to flourish. And perhaps the most notorious, infamous, famous gangster of them all is, of course, Scarface Al Capone, right? Who was in all the major cities, New York, Chicago, right? He is a bootlegger and a vice lord, as one historian called them, right? Incredibly well known of the day, and he is someone who's going to meet this need, as he will later say, and I think it comes up again in the PowerPoint. But basically he says, I'm just meeting a need of the people. They say I've broken the Prohibition law, but who hasn't, right? And Al Capone is just one example. The speakeasy is just one example of the pitfalls, the failures of Prohibition, right? It not only created crime, but it had a negative impact upon the economy, right? And I want to stress that because, I went through many years of school and I never once had anyone make the connection or make a link for me that Prohibition may have had something to do with the Great Depression, right? Or it may have had something to do with the negative economy that eventually came about, right? So we have to understand that the action taken in Prohibition had more of a negative impact than just the rise of crime and just the making of honest, citizens now dishonest because they have a beer, right? Or they have a shot of tequila or something, Al Capone says, this is stupid. I'm going to meet that need. And so he does. And he gets extremely wealthy off of it as well, right? So, all right, moving on. It goes on here. It says, like other gang lords, Capone's activities were not isolated to the selling of alcohol. Indeed, Al Capone was one who definitely dabbled in other areas of illegal activity, prostitution, gambling, what have you, right? Brings him $60 million a year in 1927. Okay, incredibly wealthy given his circumstances. Now, that $60 million a year, of course, is actually going to bring him some trouble. Because, of course, when he eventually is busted, he isn't busted for bootlegging, he isn't busted for illegal gambling or speakeasies, he's busted for tax evasion. So when you start making that much money, the IRS definitely perks up now, right? He also flaunts his money buying, expensive Cadillacs, bulletproof Cadillacs, right? All of these different things, okay? But it's interesting. He goes on to state, or it goes on to state here in my book, America, A Narrative History, it says, Capone always insisted that he was merely providing the public with goods and services it demanded. And as I've written here, he said, they say I violated the Prohibition law. Who doesn't? He neglected to say that he himself had also bludgeoned to death several conspiring police lieutenants and ordered the execution of dozens of his rival criminals. Law enforcement officials, led by FBI agent Elliot Ness, began to smash his bootlegging operations in 1929, but they were unable to pin anything on Capone until a Treasury agent infiltrated his gang and uncovered evidence that nailed him for tax evasion, which they tried him in 1931 and sentenced him to 11 years in prison. And one of the prisons he goes to is the Rock, right? Alcatraz. But Al Capone is sort of this larger-than-life figure, right? Because of Prohibition. If it hadn't been for Prohibition, we wouldn't know who Al Capone is, right? That's what Prohibition did. It made people and it made their careers. Just sort of getting on a soapbox a little bit. All right, I'll move on. Okay, again, it says Capone frequently used scare tactics to ensure that the police did not interfere with his business. Again, I sort of already alluded to that. This, however, was a short-lived business because by 1931, Capone himself would be brought down for tax evasion. Again, 11 years. Okay, I got a little bit ahead of myself. There you go. Let's not harp on this any longer. Let's go ahead and move on. Okay, we got just a couple pictures here of what officials did when they found the booze, the hooch, if you will, right? I like to think that there's another gentleman underneath, inside the sewer there with his mouth wide open, with his neck tilted as he drinks the booze that's come down. Perhaps not, but nonetheless, this is what they did. Smashing up, right? Destroying the work. Not just destroying the booze, but destroying the barrels as well so that they could not be reused. And there are hundreds of pictures of Prohibition. Hundreds of pictures very similar to this that you can find on YouTube. But just to give you a sense of what this was like. And again, if you're interested more in this topic, and it's a very interesting topic, read this book, Last Call, The Rise and Fall of Prohibition by Daniel Okrent. Or again, go look up, and if you have Netflix or Amazon Prime, then you're able to actually look up Prohibition by Ken Burns on those as well. And just take a look at it and get a sense of what happened and why this is important. Okay, next picture. Right, again, here they found a still. You can see that here on the left. They found bottles of wine or liquor. Not sure exactly what that is. It looks like those three gentlemen are deep in thought. Perhaps they're contemplating pocketing that to take home. This is clearly a staged photograph, I would think. But there, found lots of storage of hooch, right? And they're going to destroy it. Now, one of the things that's interesting about Prohibition is that there was a lot of booze that made it into the United States from outside the United States. In fact, Canada, a lot of Canadian whiskey made its way into the U.S. Illegally. And Canada, I'm sure reaped a large benefit of that. But one of the interesting facts about Prohibition was that a lot of the booze, be it whiskey from Canada or moonshine from the South or what have you, a lot of that booze went to the back door of the White House. Time and time again when you get into this, and I think, again, if you watch the Ken Burns Prohibition film, they talk about this. You'll hear people say, we drove up to the White House and, we're dropping off the hooch, right, to be consumed here by these politicians who told us we can't drink it, right? So it's just an interesting fact about Prohibition, right? But these are federal agents going to take out all this booze, going to destroy it, smash it up. I don't know, okay? But just a couple pictures, get a sense of what that era was like. Okay, it says, by 1931, former Attorney General George W. Wickersham, quote, reported evidence that enforcement of Prohibition had broken down, and And I would argue that probably prohibition enforcement of it had never really been strong to begin with. It says the speakeasies, bootlegging, rum running, and organized crime clearly depicted the failure of prohibition. And as the evidence showed, there was not much that could be done to adequately enforce the law. Okay? You can't be at all the speakeasies. You can't be in everyone's home to enforce this law. It's unenforceable. Despite the evidence, the Herbert Hoover administration, and Herbert Hoover is president of the United States in 1931. We'll be talking more about him when we get to the Great Depression. But despite the evidence, Hoover's administration said they would go ahead and keep prohibition in place. It's a difficult thing. And, you know, the reality is that during the Great Depression, people don't have a lot of money. And one of the truisms of society is that when you don't have a lot of money and you're down on your luck, people drink, right? They buy booze. Well, they can't do that openly, at least. And so that also makes Herbert Hoover not a very popular president, on top of a whole bunch of other things that we'll talk about. Okay? But, you know, Hoover's gonna hold to prohibition. Despite the evidence that says it's not working, it's breaking down. Okay? And one could argue, you know, that these types of conversations are still with us today. You know, I mean, we still have these issues and discussions about the legalization of cannabis and marijuana, right? You know, there's underground marijuana, right? There's people who buy it illegally all the time. The fact that it's illegal doesn't stop its production and consumption, right? So one has to ask themselves that question. Is prohibiting something going to benefit society as a whole? You know, and there's good arguments on both sides, okay? But perhaps that's where we can sort of see that history helps us to try and maybe deal with current circumstances. All right, moving on. All right. Eventually, the failure of prohibition becomes too much. And in 1933, a new president will be elected, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, and he decides that prohibition needs to go. So on March 23rd, 1933, prohibition was struck down when Franklin Roosevelt signed the Colin-Harrison Act, allowing the manufacture and sale of what we call 3.2 beer, or 4% alcohol by volume, right? As well as light wines. Okay. It says upon signing the document, Roosevelt made his famous remark that, "I think this would be a good time for a beer." It says the Colin-Harrison Act became law on April 7th, 1933, and the 18th Amendment was repealed by the 21st Amendment, and it was ratified in 1933 as well. Okay, and you know, here we bring back a very large sector of the economy. Okay. Okrent goes on to state at the end of his book, he says, repeal produced winners and losers in many crannies of American life, distant from the alcohol industry. Already pummeled by the Depression, Harlem nightclubs catering to a downtown clientele lost their illicit appeal, and the stylish crowds stopped traveling uptown in ermine and pearls. Intercoastal booze cruises disappeared altogether by 1938. On the other hand, the cruise to nowhere begat every passenger liner that departs a U.S. port for, say, a luxurious journey to the Caribbean and back. Country boys who had made their living racing souped-up cars ahead of revenue agents on the back roads of the South soon found people who were willing to pay to watch them race, hence the birth of NASCAR. Then there were losers who realized that some new ideas and new energy could make them winners again. After his friend Franklin Roosevelt assured him that prohibition was about to end, the Governor General of the Bahamas issued a new challenge to his executive council. Well, gentlemen, it amounts to this. If we can't take the liquor to the Americans, we must bring the Americans to the liquor, right? And of course, that is still true today. Now, what I want you to do here is there are two films I want you to watch. The first one I want you to watch is click on the word wines. It's going to take you through a little bit more information on prohibition. Specifically, it's going to take you through a couple speakeasies and talk about those speakeasies and what they were like during prohibition. So you want to watch that. The other is a film on the Monkey Scopes trial. And this is a different topic. It's a different example of nativism, right? So far, we've seen nativism sort of depicted through the Ku Klux Klan, right? As they attempt to hold up this sort of normative whiteness, virtuous values, right? We've seen nativism via prohibition, the attempt to temperance and regulate morality within sort of a Christian context, right? Monkey Scope's trial is also an example of nativism, where what we find is that Christianity is being attacked by the teaching of evolution. And so there's going to be this sort of desire to fight against it, to uphold Christian virtues, right? And so what I want you to do is watch that film on the Monkey Scopes trial. It's going to describe it, explain it a little bit, so you can get a sense of what that was as well. Your textbook also addresses the Monkey Scopes trial, so just be sure to watch these films, and then when you're done, come back, and I'm going to give you one final example of nativism in the United States and how that sort of played out. Okay? So go ahead and watch those and then come on back. Alright, the last bit of information I want to provide to you about nativism is the Sacco and Vanzetti trial. Essentially what you have here is you have two immigrants, Nicola Sacco and Bartolomeo Vanzetti. And both of these men are anarchists, and let's recall what the Ku Klux Klan was thinking about, what many nativists are thinking about, right? Who's the enemy? Who's threatening American culture, right? It's Italians with dangerous ideas, or it's Chinese with dangerous ideas. It's largely immigrants with dangerous ideas. Sacco and Vanzetti are representative of what the Ku Klux Klan and nativists see as being the problem, right? And so what I want to do is I just want to briefly read through their story and help you get a feel for why these two individuals will eventually be executed for a crime that I am not convinced they actually committed. Okay? It says, on April 15th, 1920, a paymaster for a shoe company in South Braintree, Massachusetts, and his guard were shot and killed by two men who escaped with over $1,000. It was thought from reports of witnesses that the murderers were Italians, so that already puts Sacco and Vanzetti on a target, right? Eyewitness accounts had the murderers as Italians. Now, if you know anything about eyewitness accounts, they can be problematic. People see things differently. Maybe they weren't Italians. Within a nativistic sort of sense of mind, perhaps you wanted it to be an Italian because you didn't like them. Okay, so they're Italians. It says, because Nicola Sacco and Bartolomeo Vanzetti had gone with two other Italians to a garage to claim a car that local police had connected with the crime, the two of them were arrested. Okay, so Sacco and Vanzetti themselves were not identified as the Italians who committed the crime. They just happened to show up with a group of other Italians to claim a car that police officers had linked with the crime, right? Now, both men were anarchists, and they feared deportation by the Department of Justice. And so it is likely that when questioned, these men would have said anything, right? It says both had evaded the army draft, right? That's un-American. On their arrest, they made false statements. That makes you look guilty, but again, you might make false statements for any reason, okay? Both carried firearms. Neither, however, had a criminal record, nor was there any evidence of their having had any of the money. But they are arrested and charged and tried and found guilty of having stole and shot the paymaster for this Braintree murder. Now, the evidence was sketchy. The judge was completely racist, and one has to beg the question, were these men simply made targets? Were they victimized because they were immigrants who were anarchists? Had they not been Italian anarchists, would they have been executed? I suspect probably not. In a world of nativism, I believe that this is an example of nativism gone awry. Here we go. It goes on to state here that in July 1921, they were found guilty after a trial in Dedham, Massachusetts, and sentenced to death. Many at the time believed that the conviction was unwarranted and had been influenced by the reputation of the accused as radicals when anti-radical sentiment was running high, right? Why were they accused? Because they're radicals. Why is that important? Because people are afraid of radicals, especially at this time. It says the conduct of the trial by Judge Webster Thayer was particularly criticized. Later, much of the evidence against them was discredited. In 1927, when the Massachusetts Supreme Judicial Court upheld the denial of a new trial, protest meetings were held and appeals were made to Governor Alvin T. Fuller, who eventually said that the trial had been correct and that Sacco and Vanzetti were to be executed promptly. You know, one of the things that's interesting is that when we look at some of the other evidence, we look at the fact that the judge was racist, and in fact, I believe, and I'm quote paraphrasing him, but he said something to the effect of, "Do you see what I did to those two sons of bitches today?" End quote. And he's saying this to one of his colleagues, and that colleague was actually taken aback by that comment. Like, why would you say that? You know, the conduct of Judge Thayer was such that the trial should have been tossed out because it was an unfair trial, right? The evidence, ballistic evidence at the time, suggested that the guns that they took off of Sacco and Vanzetti were not the guns that had been fired, and they didn't have any of the money, and so the evidence is very weak. Okay, but I think one of the big things that we need to look at is when these men were to be executed, there was great public outcry against it. And one has to ask the question, why would thousands of people decry the executions of two criminals if in fact they were guilty of the crime they were being accused of committing? That's a hard question to answer. Okay, but they will be executed. Moving on. It says the execution of Sacco and Vanzetti on August 22nd, 1927 was preceded by worldwide sympathy demonstrations. They were and continue to be widely regarded as martyrs. Now, I am not convinced that the evidence proves that they were guilty, but I think it's important as a historian to provide both sides. It says, however, new ballistics tests conducted with modern equipment, at least modern as of 1961, seem to prove conclusively that the pistol found on Sacco had been used to murder the guard. So this suggests that Sacco was guilty, but Vanzetti was not. In either case, one or both were falsely convicted and executed. Why? I believe because of nativism. I believe because there was this general desire to uphold this sort of normative whiteness ideology within the United States during the 1920s. Okay? And so this is a part of that story that is not generally told when we speak about the 1920s, right? We don't think about it in these terms, but I think it's important to recognize how that works, because we still deal with these issues today. Okay. All right, let's move on. So, of course, this is a picture of Sacco and Vanzetti. Just wanted to give you a name with the face. I'm not going to harp on that any longer, because I think we've spent almost an hour now talking about nativism in the 1920s. So let's move on and talk about the Roaring Twenties, those fun jazz-filled era. All right, moving on.